Welcome back to Water Quality in the Pacific Northwest. Today we're continuing to talk about a series of lectures that discuss surface water quality. Specifically, we're talking about pollutants and specific measurements. So far, the components of surface water quality that we have covered in this class included a lecture on nutrients, a lecture on sediments, a lecture on erosion on the land, and today we're starting a series of 2 lectures on the process of eutrophication. Eutrophication is a very important process that has a big impact on surface water quality. The process of eutrophication, again, is very important. Technically, we can define this process as a process where a stagnant body of water, so we're talking about a lake, a pond, or a very slow-moving stream or water behind a reservoir, becomes nutrient-rich. As nutrients are added, the nutrients support an abundant growth of algae on the surface of the water body, or a large growth of other aquatic plants on the surface of the water body. In time, the oxygen becomes depleted on the bottom of the water system, and in extreme cases can result in fish kills. Now, eutrophication is a natural process that takes place over thousands and thousands of years in the natural environment. However, eutrophication becomes a problem when humans accelerate this process, and this process occurs over a period of only a few years. To understand the process of eutrophication, we need to understand a little bit about the plant life within the lake. There are 2 distinct forms of aquatic plants in a lake. First, there are benthic plants, and there are phytoplankton. Both of these are important plants involved in a lake system, and we're going to talk about each, specifically their benefits and their problems associated with water systems. Benthic plants are basically aquatic plants that are rooted to the bottom of the water body. So their roots go into the sediment below the river, not the river, the lake or the pond, or underneath the reservoir. These benthic plants can be submerged, which means they're rooted to the bottom of the sediment, and these plants grow within the water body but never reach the surface of the water body. Or they can be emerged vegetation, where the plants are again rooted on the bottom. They grow in the water body, but they actually break the plane of the surface of the water body, and you can see these plants. So let's start out with a simple diagram, which is a cross-section of a surface of a water body. At the bottom, you see the sediment, you see the water here, and you see the surface of the water. Now let's take a look at some plants that we would list as benthic plants. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different species of benthic plants. Let's take a look at a few examples. Let's just say ordinary pondweeds. Ordinary pondweeds are rooted to the sediment at the bottom of the lake, and these plants grow within the bottom of the lake, but they never break the surface of the body of water. Muskgrass is another example. Again, rooted to the bottom of the sediments, and the growth is entirely within the water body. They never break the plane of the surface. Now let's add in some more familiar benthic plants to us. Over on the left, we have cattails. Everybody knows what a cattail is. It's a benthic plant. The plant is rooted in the sediment on the bottom of the water body. The plants grow through the water body, and they're emergent, which means they break the plane of the water, and we all see cattails above the water. Bulrushes are another example of a benthic plant. Again, rooted on the bottom of the water body, the bulrushes grow through the water, and they emerge. Over here on the right, a water lily. Again, a benthic plant rooted on the bottom of the water body, grows through the water body, and the lily pads and the flowers actually appear above the surface of the water body. And arrowheads are another example of a benthic plant. Here again, rooted on the bottom, The arrowheads grow through the water body and they reach the surface and they emerge. So these are examples of benthic plants. Benthic plants are important in a water ecosystem. These benthic plants thrive in nutrient-poor water. They don't need nutrients in the water because their roots get their nutrients out of the sediment. So they get their nutrients from the floor of the water body and they can compete because there's always nutrients for them. The benthic plants that never break the plane of the water, they're what we call submerged aquatic vegetation. They need clear water. They're plants. They're green plants. They photosynthesize. So sunlight has to be able to penetrate the water for these benthic plants to thrive and to grow. So they need clear water for enough light to photosynthesize. The depth to which adequate light can penetrate a water body is called the euphotic zone. It'll tell us where the benthic plants are and basically how productive the water body is. So again, the depth to which adequate light can penetrate is called the euphotic zone. In clear water, a clear lake, sunlight may be able to penetrate to a depth of 90 feet, and you'll see benthic plants at that depth. If the water is turbid or murky, this may be only a few inches to maybe a foot deep. The sunlight just cannot penetrate the turbid water. Okay, the other important type of benthic plant, of aquatic plant, is phytoplankton. There are numerous species of phytoplankton that float on the surface of water in stagnant bodies of water. Numerous species of algae, a lot of them are microscopic cells or microscopic threads. They remain near the surface of the water so they can get sunlight. Because they remain near the surface of the water, phytoplankton don't need clear water. They'll tolerate water that's murky or muddy or water that's full of sediments. And as a matter of fact, phytoplankton, when their numbers rapidly multiply, they actually create turbidity on the surface. Now, phytoplankton, again, they float on the body of water near the surface. They absorb light for photosynthesis, so they need light. And when conditions are right, phytoplankton grow very fast, and their mass, the number of phytoplankton can be huge if conditions are right, and they kind of form a pea green color scum on the surface of the water body. So phytoplankton can reach high densities in water that is nutrient rich. When we talk about nutrient rich water, we're talking about waters that have plenty of nitrogen and phosphorus in them. Phytoplankton, on the other hand, do not do well in water bodies that have low levels of nitrogen and phosphorus. Nitrogen and phosphorus become the limiting point of growth for phytoplankton. So we have benthic plants and we have phytoplankton. We have lakes that are either rich in nutrients or lakes that are poor in nutrients. So let's go through that aspect. So let's talk about nutrient-poor conditions. Nutrient-poor conditions in water bodies are referred to as oligotrophic conditions. This block diagram shows you an idealized setting with oligotrophic conditions. Oligotrophic conditions mean that we are nutrient poor. There's a limited amount of nitrogen and phosphorus in the system. In this block diagram, you see these underwater benthic plants. These are submerged benthic plants. They're thriving. They look really good. That's because they're getting their nutrients from the floor of the water body. These benthic plants provide basically food sources for aquatic organisms. They provide habitat for aquatic organisms, and you could say that they also supply hiding places for certain types of aquatic organisms. So this is an idealized environment with an oligotrophic condition. oligotrophic, nutrient poor. Now remember, the phytoplankton do not perform well if there's nutrient poor conditions because there's not enough nitrogen and or phosphorus for them. So the surface of the body of water is very transparent. Sunlight can penetrate the water very easily. We see oligotrophic lakes all the time in areas that are minimally used by humans. Here's an example of an oligotrophic water body. This is a mountain lake, high elevation. You can look down to into this lake and you see very clear water. The sunlight can penetrate this lake to a pretty good depth. Nutrient poor conditions, rich conditions for benthic plants, good conditions for the aquatic life in these water bodies. So again, oligotrophic conditions can be defined as being nutrient poor. And if you're going to see an oligotrophic lake, you're going to find that there has been minimal input by humans into these water bodies. Most ecosystems untouched by humans are also oligotrophic in nature. So when we have nutrient poor conditions or oligotrophic conditions, you don't have enough nutrients for rapid phytoplankton growth. Phytoplankton are there floating on the surface of the water, but there aren't many of them. Oligotrophic conditions mean clear water. Sunlight can penetrate that water to a pretty deep depth, and that allows benthic plants to photosynthesize even at fairly moderate depths within a lake, maybe to a depth of 30 to 60 feet. Benthic plants are good. In addition to providing habitat, hiding places, and food for aquatic organisms, they help in maintaining dissolved oxygen in the water, particularly in the deep water. And aquatic life needs dissolved oxygen in the deep portions of the water. So in summary about oligotrophic lakes are nutrient poor, but they're oxygen rich. There's a lot of oxygen in the water from the surface all the way to deeper depths. As a result, oligotrophic lakes are a good environment for fish, shellfish, and many diverse aquatic ecosystems. This is the way things are supposed to happen in nature. Now, if we go from nutrient-poor conditions, which are oligotrophic conditions, to nutrient-rich conditions, we call nutrient-rich conditions as eutrophic conditions, nutrient enrichment, eutrophication. So eutrophic conditions, we're talking about nutrient-rich conditions. We get a rapid growth and multiplication of phytoplankton. When we add nutrients such as nitrogen and or phosphorus to the water body, all of a sudden phytoplankton aren't limited in growth. They have all the nitrogen and phosphorus they need, and they just rapidly multiply. Now, these phytoplankton actually increase the turbidity of water because you've got all these organisms floating on the surface of the water, and they create turbidity. And some people would say you often see a yellow-green or green scum on the surface of the water body. If we think back to our block diagram we looked at just a few moments, remember our oligotrophic conditions where we had a really nice environment with plenty of benthic plants and aquatic organisms? Well, when we start adding nutrients in the top part of this block diagram, you can see that the phytoplankton grow tremendously on the surface of the body of water, and they actually make the water turbid. So it's less transparent and it's harder for sunlight to penetrate. And remember, these benthic plants down here need sunlight. These benthic plants are still alive here, but they're not doing as well because they don't have much photosynthesis. When the benthic plants aren't doing very well, it's also difficult for the aquatic organisms. There's not enough hiding places for these aquatic organisms, not enough habitat, and less food. So you see the fish aren't too happy. and crustaceans and other things are not doing as well. If you continue to add nutrients to the system, you end up with a totally nutrient-rich environment. And in this nutrient-rich environment, you have very little desirable aquatic life. You can see that the phytoplankton have continued to grow. Phytoplankton don't live a long time, so they die. Their dead bodies fall to the bottom of the water body. More plankton replace them, but eventually these plankton will use an awful lot of the nutrients that are floating in the water. The phytoplankton, the dead ones, they fall to the bottom of the water body. The benthic plants have all died because there's not enough sunlight for them to photosynthesize. Many of the aquatic organisms have died for several reasons. They don't have a habitat, they don't have enough food, they don't have enough hiding places from their predators, and the deep part of the water becomes oxygen depleted. The deep part of the water becomes oxygen depleted because the dead phytoplankton settle on the bottom of the body of water, and decomposers come out to chew up these phytoplankton, to recycle them in the environment. And these decomposers preferentially use the dissolved oxygen. They have a better ability to use that dissolved oxygen than the aquatic organisms. So you end up with not a very pretty picture. We see eutrophied bodies of water all the time. Here's an example of a picture. Here's a very slow flowing stream, or maybe it's just a pond, but basically you can see that the surface of the body of water is not an attractive place to go swimming. You've got this pea green scum, which is basically algae sitting on the surface of the body of water. There's very few benthic plants on the bottom of the water body because sunlight can't penetrate. No benthic plants, very few aquatic organisms. So when we get nutrient enrichment, we basically have phytoplankton that start shading out the benthic plants below. So this scum on the surface, the benthic plants, the scum on the surface created by the phytoplankton, they shade out the benthic plants. And when you start shading out the benthic plants, you interrupt the food chain of the ecosystem and you end up with a loss of habitat. Now, it's just not phytoplankton that can cause eutrophication in a body of water. Sediments or runoff of soils from land also creates turbidity. Sediments can stay suspended in water, they create turbidity, and the sunlight cannot penetrate. Sediments are also soil particles, and most of these soil particles have phosphorus ions attached to them. Phosphorus is one of the nutrients that causes phytoplankton to rapidly grow. So again, our problem with enrichment is the benthic plants decline. You end up with a loss of oxygen in the deep water. You'll have plenty of oxygen on the surface where the phytoplankton are, but you need the oxygen distributed throughout the water. So if we take what we just learned and put it into a cycle. Here's our cycle. Somebody adds nutrients to the water, some industry, maybe agriculture, maybe urbanization, maybe the treatment of our wastewater. All of a sudden, nutrients are added to the lake. The phytoplankton floating on the top rapidly multiply because a lack of nutrients was preventing the phytoplankton from growing very much. The phytoplankton rapidly multiply. They create some shade, make the water turbid. The water becomes less desirable for the benthic plants. But eventually the phytoplankton that are rapidly multiplying on the surface of the body of water die. When they die, their bodies fall down to the bottom of the water. And then the decomposers come in and break down the dead algae. Well, the decomposers need oxygen to decompose the algae, so they suck oxygen out of the deep water. And the decomposers sucking oxygen out of the deep water deprives oxygen, or deprives the aquatic organisms from this oxygen. If there's too much decomposition in the bottom of the water, you end up with no oxygen for the aquatic organisms, and you may end up with dead fish. So if we take a look at our oligotrophic blocks again, we have the oligotrophic condition, which is a nutrient-poor condition, but a very desirable water ecosystem condition. Again, you can see the water is clear, very few algae on the surface. The benthic plants are thriving because they get all the nutrients from the sediments. They're thriving, they're providing habitat, hiding places, and food for several of the aquatic organisms. They could be mollusks, crustaceans, fish, whatever. You start adding the nutrients, and the system starts to decline. The phytoplankton rapidly grow. That shades out the benthic plants. Sunlight can't penetrate, so the benthic plants do a fairly poor job of photosynthesizing. With few benthic plants or benthic plants in poor shape, there's fewer hiding places, there's worse habitat, and there's less food for the aquatic organisms. So we start to see the aquatic organisms start to decline. And if we keep this up, keep putting nutrients in the system, we can end up with eutrophic conditions where we basically have a system that's almost biologically dead. I mean, there's still organisms in there, but biologically they don't have the types of organisms that a healthy water body should have. Basically, anything that depletes oxygen in the water is also a problem. If we add organic materials to the water, the organic materials have to be decomposed by microbes in the water. The microbes will use oxygen that is dissolved in the water, and that's oxygen that is not of use to the aquatic organisms. So if we add organic materials to the water, we will deplete the oxygen. And the organic materials could be in the form of erosion, soils moving off the land. It could be in the form of raw sewage, or it could be in the form of other organic wastes. Now we can go out and measure the health of a system. There's several different measurements we can take. We talked about a couple measurements in the third lecture of class, but one I want to emphasize here is we can measure the health of a lake by taking a reading that we call the BOD. The BOD stands for the biological oxygen demand by organisms in the water, or the biochemical oxygen demand. And basically what a BOD is, it measures what oxygen in the water is demanded to break substances down. So your BOD sample looks at your suspended organic materials in the water that need to be broken down, and then how much oxygen is in the water. If the biological oxygen demand by decomposers is greater than the amount of dissolved oxygen already in the water, you're going to get oxygen depletion. If this is extreme, you may end up with fish kills. So eutrophication, I mentioned, was a natural process, but there's really two types of eutrophication. There's natural eutrophication, which takes place over thousands of years, and what we would call human-caused or cultural eutrophication. So in our oligotrophic lakes, we can get an occasional burst of phytoplankton growth or algae blooms every once in a while. An oligotrophic lake becomes nutrient-rich over thousands and thousands of years. It's a natural process. Occasionally a mountain lake, which is oligotrophic, might have an algae bloom. And it might just be from some localized environment that just occurs for one summer. For instance, we have a little pond and a moose died in the pond. Well, the moose is all organic material. You've got that huge animal out there, and the decomposers go wild, and they decompose the moose, and because there's so many nutrients at that time, you get an algae bloom. Next year, it won't be there. So it's just a temporary type thing. But if humans speed up the process of eutrophication by adding nutrients or sediments to a body of water, we call it cultural eutrophication. And there's a few examples of cultural eutrophication that are world examples. Probably one of the best examples historically in the United States has been Lake Erie, which is one of the 5 Great Lakes in the north central part of the country. This is a pretty pathetic rendering, but we can combat eutrophication by taking one of 2 approaches. We can first attack the symptoms, or we can control the inputs. What nutrients, what sediments, and from where are putting things into the water. Well, logically, it's better to control the inputs, but in reality, inputs are much harder to control. So oftentimes we've gone for attacking the symptoms. We have a short-term solution, but it doesn't address this long-term issue. So in attacking the symptoms, we have 3 approaches that have been used with some success in the past, or what I would say with some successes, but varying degrees of success. So let's take a look at attacking the symptoms. We see algae growing all over our water. One thing we could do is apply chemical treatments to kill the algae. Herbicides are chemicals that kill plants, and remember, algae are plants. So we can spray herbicides, and it will suppress the growth of unwanted plants, including algae. The problem with this is we don't like putting herbicides into water systems because water systems directly affect public health. But on a one-time use basis, we can apply herbicides. But if we have to use herbicides, we're going to have to use them continuously if we want to keep the algae out of the water, if we don't want to control the source of those nutrients or sediments. Another way of attacking the system is to artificially introduce oxygen into the deep water of the system. That will prevent fish kills. You can mechanically add oxygen to the water to reduce fish kills. And this would work for a small body of water, something 20 acres or smaller in size, but it's an ongoing expense. If it's a large body of water, mechanical aeration isn't going to do you any good. And the third way people have attacked the symptoms of eutrophication would actually be to skim the algae off the surface of the body of water. You have a filtering device that skims across the surface of the water and it filters out the algae. It can work. It's feasible only in very small water bodies, and it doesn't solve the problem. You're still adding nutrients to the water body, and you're going to get more algae growth. So those 3 methods of attacking, of controlling eutrophication by attacking the symptoms are one-time use events, and they only work for small bodies of water. So you have not solved the problem. It's far more logical to control the inputs. Let's find where the nutrients are coming from on the land and keep those nutrients on the land. Let's find where erosion's occurring on the landscape and prevent erosion so those sediments don't enter the water body. So we need to decrease the inputs of nutrients and to control sediments. Nice ideas, but it's more expensive, and it can be pretty intense because the more people, the more things that go on in the watershed, the more difficult it is to control nutrient and sediment input. So it's really a challenge to control eutrophication, particularly in areas where we have larger populations. The other eutrophication poster child in North America would have to be the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay is in eastern North America. I have a fairly small diagram here. If you can see the red area in the eastern United States, the Chesapeake Bay is a very large estuary in the United States. It covers parts of the states of Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and a few watersheds in southeastern Pennsylvania. Chesapeake Bay is important because it's the largest estuary in North America. And before 1970, it was North America's most productive estuary. So it once was a very productive estuary. We're talking about crabs. We're talking about fish. The fishing industry was very large here, and the hauls of fish and crustaceans were huge. However, scientists in the late 1960s began to notice that seagrasses, which were found near the mouth of many rivers that drain into Chesapeake Bay, started to die. And the death of these seagrasses became bigger and bigger, or more and more each year. And the death of these seagrasses was very dramatic by 1975. And most of the grasses were gone by 1980. Well, to most people, these seagrasses were weeds at the bottom of the river. But to an ecologist, these seagrasses were benthic plants that provided habitat, food, and hiding places to the aquatic and shellfish organisms. So as the benthic plants died, so did the fish that were caught. So the populations of organisms that depended upon the seagrasses declined steeply. Fish catches went way down in the estuary. Shellfish catches went way down, and the populations of waterfowl were drastically reduced within the estuary. Why would the waterfowl bother to fish there when their target organisms were gone? You move still into the 1970s, scientists went out and found the cause of the problem were the bottom waters, the deep waters in the bay were oxygen depleted. So they were no longer a healthy system for the shellfish and the fish. And the lack of oxygen was causing the fish and the shellfish to suffocate. And from 1965 until the late 70s, the fish catch dropped by 90%. It still hasn't come back very far since then. So why did this happen? It happened basically because nutrients were added to the system. The waters got turbid by sediments and by the phytoplankton growing from the nutrient enrichment. The water became turbid. That cut off the light required for photosynthesis by the seagrass. The seagrass died, and basically the sediments and the phytoplankton caused the system to fall apart. The bay basically fell victim to eutrophication. And hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent trying to rehabilitate the Chesapeake Bay. It's better than it was in the 70s, but it has still not come back that far. One of the things that I think that's very interesting and important about the Chesapeake Bay is that Washington, D.C. is in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. While the Chesapeake Bay was declining, Congress was in session. This large focus on the Chesapeake Bay by the public and the fact that Congress was right there basically was the cause of Congress passing a lot of water quality legislation in the 1970s. Had the Chesapeake Bay not gotten bad, the country would have been fairly complacent when it came to laws about water quality. But Chesapeake Bay really spurred the politicians on. Okay, when we come back to the next lecture, we'll take a look at eutrophication examples here in the Pacific Northwest, and then continue to talk about sources of nutrients and sediments and how we prevent these nutrients and sediments from entering water bodies and causing eutrophication. Thank you for your attention. Happens to be an outline of Lake Erie here. The big lake north of Lake Erie is Lake Huron. Lake Erie, of the 5 Great Lakes, is the lake that's most subjected to eutrophication for 3 primary reasons. First of all, it's the smallest lake as far as volume of water. It's a very shallow lake compared to the other 5 Great Lakes. And the third reason is it has tremendous amounts of farmland and industrial activity that surround the lake in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and the province of Ontario. The other Great Lakes aren't necessarily so. For instance, Lake Superior is primarily surrounded by forests. Lake Michigan has a mix of forest land and farmland in cities. Huron isn't that industrial, not a lot of farmland. And Lake Ontario, it's rugged upper New York and part of Canada. So Lake Erie is the most vulnerable. In the mid-1960s, biological scientists noticed that things were changing in Lake Erie, and we were starting to see signs of eutrophication. Well, if you look around Lake Erie and look at all the cities on the shore, there's a lot of human inputs. Detroit sits up here, so the waste from Detroit flows downriver into Lake Erie. Toledo, a huge manufacturing town, sits here. Cleveland, a major manufacturing center in Ohio, sits here. Erie, Pennsylvania sits here. There's several towns in southern Ontario that drain into Lake Erie. So you have a lot of industrial chemicals, a lot of urban population that are emitting nutrients and sediments, and you have a lot of farmland that surrounds Lake Erie. So nutrients washing off of farmland can cause problems too. A lot of extreme events happened in Lake Erie in the 1960s. Probably the most famous one was in Cleveland, Ohio, which sits right here where the arrow is. The river that flows through Cleveland and empties into Lake Erie, called the Cuyahoga River, actually caught fire one summer from all the industrial chemicals that were going down the river. Lake Erie has gotten better. It still has eutrophication problems, but it's not the mess it was in the 1960s because of practices humans started to employ to try and keep the lake in better shape. Well, if we find a body of water that has been eutrophied, what do we do about it?